Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined as always by Dan.
Hello.
And Derek.
Hello.
So, I like to start each episode by asking you guys if you've listened to anything interesting lately.
Yeah, I've been listening to Exuma, the first self-titled record. They finally put it on Spotify. It's like this weird, like, freak folk record from the Bahamas from 1970. It's, like, really nuts and really awesome.
Huh.
I haven't listened to anything outside of what we are doing for the show. However, I did revisit The Godfather this past week. And, obviously we have Nino Rota's soundtrack. I don't know if you guys listen to any of his other film soundtracks, but you guys think we could ever do a podcast on movie soundtracks?
Only
fun.
Yeah, maybe like Blade Runner.
Yeah, something like that. Longtime listeners of the podcast will remember on our previous podcast when we reviewed Mike's, the rapper Mike, his breakthrough mixtape, May God Bless Your Hustle, and got in a little spat with him. He went to Twitter to talk a bunch of shit about us, basically, which is weird because we liked the album, but he just seemed really to take issue with how we described the sound, which is weird, and compared him to Earl Sweatshirt a little bit. And, anyway, he was pretty angry, but I'm happy to report that his new mixtape, Tears of Joy, I think is really fantastic. So, Mike, I'm ready to, put the beef to rest if you are. Anyway, let's jump into today's topic. A few weeks ago, the legendary Warp Records celebrated their 30th anniversary by taking over NTS Radio for a 3-day online music festival, and it might have been the best music festival I've ever attended. No sweating my ass off, waiting in line to buy tickets that will then allow me to buy like an $8 beer, and most importantly, amazing mixes and performances from Warp juggernauts like Autechre Twin, Autechre, Boards of Canada, Square Pusher, Flying Lotus, Danny Brown, Death Grips, One of Tricks Point Ever, and a whole lot more. The event got us talking about some of our favorite Warp albums, and we decided we should make a podcast episode about it. Instead of the all-time classics that have been discussed to death, though, we each picked a semi-underrated gem from Warp's vast catalog that we wanted to introduce each other to. I went with Boards of Canada's In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country EP from 2000. I know it's hard to call that underrated, but it's at least not Music Has the Right to Children. Darren chose Broadcast, Ha Ha Sound from 2003, and Dan picked Autechre's L Event EP from 2013. We're going to go in-depth on each of these releases, but I'm hoping we can use them to branch out into these artists' larger discographies a little bit, as well as the legacy of Warp Records 30 years after its founding. I think chronological order makes the most sense here, so we'll start with my pick. What is your guys' previous experience, opinion on Boards of Canada, and particularly this 2000 EP, In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country?
I'm a huge fan of Boards of Canada, have been for quite a while. Love this EP. That's about it. What about you, Darren?
I am just sort of a fan. I mean, I've obviously listened to Music Has a Right to Children, love that album. Didn't really branch out beyond that, so this is my first time with this EP.
Wow. Okay. So, yeah, I'm a pretty huge fan. Really, really got obsessed back in the day. But then, for some reason, it's like Boards of Canada isn't something I've revisited very often. And, I actually, we'll probably get into it, but I sort of enjoyed doing that this week. I picked this EP, In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country, because we were kind of, I thought that I should pick something that's kind of representative so we can talk about Boards of Canada in a larger sense a little bit. And they're two twin classics, Music Has the Right to Children, and then Geo Gaddy. I actually have never even looked up how to pronounce this, but this EP comes right between those two sort of masterpieces. And, the first one is quite melodic, almost funky, nostalgic fun. The second one gets into a lot darker and mysterious kind of tones and stuff. And I feel like this kind of sits very nicely right in the middle. So we all were listening to it this week. How would you guys describe the sound of this EP?
I mean, Boards of Canada, they've got that nostalgia sound on lock.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's on tape, but it's not even cassette tape. It almost sounds like it's VHS tape or something.
Yeah.
You can
like a reel to reel or something.
Yeah, and it just has this feel of their name is a reference to those Canadian board film, those sort of public service films about nature or whatever. They sample them a lot, but it really feels like that. They do a good job of this environment building and atmosphere building in their music. And it's I feel like when you hear it, you instantly know that it's Boards of Canada.
Yeah, how would you describe it, Darren, as a new listener, at least to this EP?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I kind of want to describe it in contrast to sort of like Autechre, just because they were like going head to head in my listening all week. And the word like sort of like mellow, almost like chill, kind of comes to mind with Boards of Canada, versus Autechre it just seems a little bit more aggressive in places. Boards of Canada, as far as like, and again, this is me being like not a scholar of electronic music, but there's not like all these like glitches and crazy sounds happening. Like everything kind of has a lot of space. All the instruments, you can kind of understand what's going on. I'm not like kind of left wondering like, what is this sound that I'm hearing? You know what I mean? That's really not what they seem to be going for at all.
Yeah, it's something I want to talk about more later, obviously, but yeah, if this is really about like nostalgia, Autechre seems like to be not interested in nostalgia in any way. But yeah, there's something about like, I don't know how much sampling Boards of Canada does, but everything kind of sounds sampled. Like you were saying, Dan, like it sounds like they're taken from old, grainy, warped, no pun intended, sources. And it's got this kind of lo-fi vibe. It's also, really, it's kind of like soulful and groovy. I think there's a lot of hip hop influence on Boards of Canada, with their beats.
Oh, yeah.
And also like, you listen to the first song on this EP, Kid for Today. It's like just these melodic like synth lines they're like as sort of soulful as Herbie Hancock or something. And they do a lot of like just these little lines that they almost like toss off in kind of like a, that kind of like thing that I like Paul McCartney so much for. Like, how did he just come up with that melody and why did he only sing it once? And, you could make a whole song out of it. They just seem to like throw off these little like lines that are just amazing. And that was something that kind of struck me this week is the composition of these tracks. In particular, it's like they're really amazingly composed because they're like these warm pad sounds or something, but then these kind of like lines and stuff are just intersecting and weaving. Darren, you kind of described it as like very kind of empty and spacious, which I agree with. But did you kind of feel that, like feel impressed at all with like the composition, the arrangement of these like melodic lines and things?
Yeah, definitely. It kind of, to me, sort of sounds like a painting or, like watching somebody paint large, strokes of color. You know what I mean? I don't want to like dumb it down to like those silly like screensaver types of things, but
yeah,
it's just I imagine it kind of like that. And when you think about the name of the title or the title of the album, In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country, I think it really brings that sort of feeling out. You know what I mean? Like I really imagine like countryside, and like with electronic music, it's kind of odd, but it seems to work really well. Like it's very cohesive.
I completely agree with you. Like it always like sort of brings an image to my mind.
Yeah.
I always sort of think of like, like a, was it like Super 8, like a real grainy, like, silent video of, a countryside or something, maybe a river or something with Boards of Canada. So yeah, I see what you're saying there, Dan.
And like the cover of this album has these little like slide
projectors. That's kind of, and maybe that's what makes me think of it.
But also when you listen to like Kid for Today, it's almost like the drum beat, it at first just sounds like this clicking, and it sounds like when you're switching slides, like on an old projector to me, and then it sort of like becomes part of the beat. Also interesting though with this EP, how it kind of, in some ways it's like a little bit disappointing because I really like on their full length albums, they do these kind of ambient excursions. And I think that their like compositional skill really shines because these little 90-second pieces will be so just, jaw-dropping to me. Here, we don't have a lot of space for that, but we do get like the second and fourth track, Amo Bishop, Rodin, and Zoetrope, are much more on the ambient side and kind of like, just much like dreamier and driftier. Do you guys feel like this EP flows well?
I mean, as much as like a 4-track EP can, like Darren said, it does feel like very cohesive. It feels like one piece of work. But I get what you're saying about it does lose like their normal albums are always like fairly long, and there's like those little interludes with samples and the talking and stuff, and that does sort of like paint a bigger picture and like build more of a environment and atmosphere. But I think they do it like as well as you could do it in 4 tracks and what is it, like 25 minutes or something?
Yeah. I kind of feel like it has an impressive arc almost, because it starts really in mellow mode. Like some things on Music Has the Right to Children, they get like quite funky, but this starts like really in that mellow vibe, and then it just seems to like kind of get mellower and mellower, and then Zoetrope is like this nice like ambient coda. It's almost like a, you know, it's got like a minimalist, like kind of Reich or Riley kind of vibe to it. But Darren, did you feel like it flowed well?
Yeah, I really do. You know, a lot of EPs sometimes just sound like throwaway songs or just attempting to experiment, but this seems like an idea that from start to finish is kind of like fleshed out. I mean, it's not, you know, as big as an LP like what you're describing, but I feel like it accomplishes kind of what it sets out to do. And by the time you get to the last track, I feel like or the track before that, you're out in the countryside, you know, it's daytime, and then the last track, it just feels like the sun has gone down. It's like nighttime. Like I don't know why, it just feels like it's a perfect ending track, even though it's only been like 20 minutes. Like I just feel like I look forward to getting to this track. So it has like such great closure, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting how it like earns a coda in such a short amount of time. And I think it's just such a like gorgeous song. It's just like these intersecting notes, and again, like that compositional skill, because it just like really flows and grows in an interesting way. So a big question I kept asking myself this week is, you know, when you think of like Warp Records, right? And Boards of Canada is really like one of the biggest, most important artists on the roster. You know, you think kind of like future looking, like a futurist ethos, you know, they sort of like hit the, you know, come out with these like artificial intelligence series. They're like inventing this idea of IDM, you know, intelligent dance music, a problematic term, yes, but, you know, it's really future looking. And then this feels so like vintage and nostalgic, and it's like, would you guys describe it as really forward thinking or like really nostalgic music?
I mean, it sounds in like all of Boards of Canada, it like sounds nostalgic, but it's like it sort of, it reminds me of like vaporwave, and not that it sounds like it at all, but like, you know, vaporwave is like nostalgic for a period that like didn't really exist.
Yeah.
And I kind of get like that same feeling of Boards of Canada. It's like they're nostalgic for like a world they created, which I guess is like sort of a, you know, it's sort of based on something like, you know, those videos and everything, but like, you know, it's not like a real place and time. So I don't know. Can you like, making your own nostalgia, I think, is sort of like a forward thinking idea in a weird roundabout way.
And they're really interested in like the occult and stuff in a weird way. And it like makes this really eerie, kind of creepy, like world building. Yeah, I think. Darren, what do you think? My earlier question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I didn't really listen to this album thinking like this is the year 2000. You know what I mean?
It doesn't sound like any year though, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Like, I just don't feel like it fits in anywhere. I don't feel like it's nostalgic just because I can't really pinpoint it. It almost feels like, I almost want to say like timeless. Like it could be anywhere. You know what I mean? So in a way, I feel like that's like forward thinking, because, you know, I mean, if I'm listening to this in 2019 and still feeling like if this came out yesterday, I'd be like, yeah, cool. This is a cool record. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's so weird because back when I was first listening to Boards of Canada, and it's kind of funny because when I was discovering this was the era when like you would make ringtones, you know, for your own phone.
Yeah.
And so I had In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country as like my like alarm sound or whatever. And it's amazing that it doesn't bug me, you know, now like it used to. But, you know, anyway, it's just like I thought of it as the most future, like forward looking thing, because there's nothing like mechanical about this. It's so like warm and human and flowing, and like I said, like almost a Herbie Hancock touch on the like synthesizer. It's just like, you know what I mean? You listen to electronic music and sometimes intentionally so it sounds stiff, but you listen to like almost that like mid 90s kind of stuff, and it sounds like a little primitive, a little archaic in a way, you know, especially that like early IDM and stuff, like Autechre's like earliest albums kind of a vibe. And this just sounds so fully embodied, so fully human. It doesn't sound like who even cares if you're listening to a synthesizer or electronic music? It's just like music at this point. So it's weird because I thought of it as the most forward-looking thing. It's interesting that they are consciously like trying to look back in order to do that. But I also found myself thinking a lot about their legacy, okay? Because it feels like the influence of their sound is just immense to me. It's like, I feel like just their production is so like spacious and clean and perfect. I feel like, Nigel Godrich of Radiohead is just kind of like trying to, be Boards of Canada in a way. Like that's what serves the Radiohead sound. And, there's stuff like, it just seems to have had such a huge influence on like the sound of electronic music and how lived in and human it can be. And yet, are you guys familiar with this like lo-fi hip hop radio thing?
Yeah, the lo-fi beats to study to or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever listened to that, Darren?
I haven't.
So, it's like this 24-hour channel on YouTube where it just plays like kind of lo-fi hip hop beats, all right? Like all the time. And the idea is you could, it's kind of pleasant or whatever, just have in the background while you're reading or whatever, or relaxing. And it's just kind of like poor man's versions of Boards of Canada tracks to me. And that's how like saturated the Boards of Canada sound is that there are like thousands of just no-name producers who will never know. There's enough to like fill actually several 24-hour stations,
Wow.
And it's like, do you feel like that's damaged the freshness, the innovativeness of their sound at all? How prevalent their sound kind of is now?
I don't think so, because I think they just do it like so much better than everything. Like I've listened to that channel, just to check it out and stuff. And, you're like, it sounds like Boards of Canada, but like it doesn't actually sound like Boards of Canada. You know what I mean? Like I'm not going to confuse it for an actual Boards of Canada song, because like you said, that production is like so great in Boards of Canada, and like that's just something that like, I mean, it just takes too much talent. It's like how many bands like wanted to be the Beatles. There's only one Beatles. The Boards of Canada like kind of have like the sound on lock. So I don't think it like hurts their image or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think like even more so than just the sound, I think their ability to texturize and sort of construct this whole EP, and for it to paint these images in your head and like be able to earn that like concluding track so well, I don't think that just people ripping off the sound like that's the element that's really missing. You know what I mean? Because I came to this album thinking, the first time I listened to it, I was like, oh, this is kind of like not boring, but just like, okay, what's really happening here? It doesn't, it's where's all the glitching and the beeps and stuff, you know what I mean? But over time listening to it, I was like, I started to like really love it. I never stopped. I was like start to finish. Because I wanted to get to that last track, and I haven't listened to this 24-hour channel thing, but I imagine it just doesn't have that kind of effect on you. You know what I mean? It's just background noise, background music, or whatever.
I think the other thing too is like what really helps their legacy is that they don't release music very often.
That's
like
true.
If they were just dumping this stuff out left and right, then
oh yeah, for sure.
It would cheapen it, and you wouldn't. But now it's like, I mean, when was the last Boards of Canada record? Like 6 years ago or something? Maybe more than that. What is it? Yeah, 2013. I mean, if we get another one next year, like it'll be a big deal. Or, because it might not be next year. It might be 4 more, who knows? And I think that like really solidifies like their legacy, that people would be like so excited if we still, if we got one.
People like dropped everything to check out this mix that they did for the Warp Takeover, and it was actually just a straight up mix. People are like, what if it's going to be a new album and stuff like that? And I thought it was very cool. But yeah, they do have like an interesting. I felt like I was surprised actually this week to learn that Campfire Head Phase, I think it's called, their album, their third album. It's like got kind of a following, kind of like strong defenders, and I could never get into that one because it sounded like their influences had caught up with them. It just sounded kind of like the way that like electronic and indie like kind of just had fused by 2005, 2006, and it just kind of sounded like they had been caught up to it, and they just didn't sound that innovative anymore. And I really liked their 2013 record, Tomorrow's Harvest, but it sounded kind of like they were just like, well, let's go back to like kind of doing our thing and just be the best at it. And I think before this week, I would have said, you know what? I don't think Boards of Canada has aged that well because they've just been ripped off too mercilessly. And yet, after spending a week like revisiting this EP and a lot of other of their stuff, I do kind of feel like they're just so good at. They're like the My Bloody Valentine Loveless of shoegaze. You could rip that off forever and it'll never be topped. Sort of. So I don't know how familiar you are, Dan, with kind of like their newer stuff. Do you also agree that they've just kind of stopped innovating?
No, I mean, I like Campfire Head Phase and I like Tomorrow's Harvest. Yeah, I mean, is it as innovative as Gio Gotti or Music Has the Right to Children? Like, no, maybe not. But I mean, who stays that innovative for that long? Like when you basically invent a genre, you get to coast by a little bit after that, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's true. So I think that what we should do is sort of move along to Darren's pick, and we can sort of keep jumping back and forth and comparing and contrasting this. But I do want to, Darren, would you say that you kind of loved this? You liked it? You're glad I made you listen to it? How are you feeling?
I'd say I'd like it. I think I could love it. I'm going to keep it around. Like I mentioned, I listened to Boards of Canada back in the day. I don't know. I just kind of forgot about them. I didn't really come back to them. And this EP has definitely got me interested in checking out that other masterpiece you guys have been talking about.
Okay. But because you have not felt the pull to return to them, are you kind of like feeling like I was before this week, or you're kind of like it's not that fresh anymore?
I mean, I think I went into it thinking that, but like I said, I think the CP has kind of like changed my mind about just how good they are at what they do.
All right. Well, if Boards of Canada is kind of like representative of the sound of Warp's golden age, I think Broadcast, your pick, Darren, is an interesting example of Warp beginning to branch out beyond IDM the way they eventually would with acts like Grizzly Bear and Danny Brown. Like Death Grips is on the label now, and it's gotten quite diverse as they've tried to like sort of grow and evolve. So I'll just say that again, Darren picked Ha Ha Sound from 2003, their second LP, I believe, and I had never listened to this before. I had listened to their first LP maybe like once, but I really had just no memory of it, and I threw it on this week and I didn't remember anything about it. Dan, do you have a lot of experience with Broadcast?
Nah, I've never listened to this record before this week, and I had listened to their first album years ago, but I barely recall. I remembered it was like an indie band with a female singer, but that was about it.
Well, what's your previous experience, Darren, and why did you pick this album?
Yep, so probably somewhere like 10 years ago or so, I either came across, somebody showed me one song, or I happened across a playlist or something with the song Tears in the Typing Pool, which is from their third album, and that kind of just got me interested in checking out that record, which was Tender Buttons, and then I ended up going back to Ha Ha Sounds. Surprisingly, I never really listened to that first album very much at all. Most of my time has been spent with the latter two. But picked up on Ha Ha Sound and really just immediately kind of fell in love with it. Even wrote a review on Rate Your Music for it. So I loved it.
I do want to ask you about that. I stumbled upon it, funny enough. But yeah, go on.
I picked it over Tender Buttons because I feel like with Tender Buttons, they sort of, the Broadcast had more than just two members and kind of in and out with like drummers and people coming in to play like, either synth or keyboard or whatever. Tender Buttons specifically only had just the two like remaining members, Trish, the singer, and then the other guy, whatever his name is. And you can kind of tell that the sound is sort of like stripped down a bit. I like that album a lot, but Ha Ha Sound I think is like kind of the perfect record that sort of captures them maybe at their peak, kind of exploring a lot more ground, I feel like.
Yeah, so I think that we should try to describe the sound. And Dan, as a fellow first-time listener, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I mean, it's like indie rock, with a female singer, but I think it's a little more interesting than that. There's like the whole time, like I'm trying to think of the best way to like describe it. There's like sort of like weird electronic things that frequently sort of happen in the background, but often where you could miss it if you're not paying attention. So it was like a sort of like a odd mix of indie rock, like that indie electronic thing that was kind of big in the early 2000s, but mixed with like a little bit more of a IDM type sound happening, which maybe is why they're on Warp.
Yeah, I really so I struggled with this album a lot, and it like continued and continues, I think, to grow on me. But I've been listening to a lot of Stereolab lately, and this first struck me as like a poor man's Stereolab, and I couldn't like get over it because it's kind of like a soft, breathy female vocal over like your favorite record collection being sampled or something like that. But it's a pretty interesting sound because it's got this kind of like lullaby type vocal melodies by this girl, and often very like simple melodies. There's not a lot of harmonizing much at all, which is quite different from Stereolab. And yeah, the music is weird, honestly. It like seems to come from the almost like 60s psychedelic tradition of a band like United States of America or something. But there's like these electronic elements. I think of like 50-Foot Hose as like a weird 60s, experimenting with like early synthesis. Even going back so far as like, that like Telstar song by the Tornadoes, first ever synthesizer. Or even like, you could think of like a more popular example, like the Beach Boys using theremin, which is a synthesizer, like incorporating that, like experiment, because this was the time, like the 60s, people were like just discovering this stuff, and there you've got these like electroacoustic kind of avant-garde people like Stockhausen and Oliveros and stuff, and they're doing this, and it's like filtering its way into psychedelic music of the 60s, and I feel like that's what's being evoked here. It's also like those albums in the sense that they almost like, back then they didn't have like a good control, or maybe they just didn't have like good equipment because synthesis was so new, where it gets like really loud and clattery and out of control. And so Darren, I wanted to ask you, because in that Rate Your Music review from years ago that I found, you said you kind of liked how it's like these like nice vocals and the backing music isn't trying to do too much, which I understand why you would say that. And yet I felt like there's so much like clattering noise on every song. It's like minimalist, but also really like everything is like glitching, and like the drums are like just like over these soft vocals. I mean, isn't it kind of like clattering in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. And I think what I find most attractive about it is the fact that you're sort of bringing together not necessarily polar opposites, but definitely things that you wouldn't imagine going together. So this very noisy, glitchy, sort of distorted psychedelic sound with, almost like lullaby like vocals from the 60s, you know what I mean? So like pop,
yeah,
the cleanest, girl group of the 60s sort of like vocal melodies being mixed in with this, just, it immediately you might catch you off as like, or you might think of it as like a gimmick, or like, oh, they're just slapping these two things together and seeing what happens. But
this was my what I struggled with, because it sometimes felt like the noise is working against the song. Like they wrote like it's almost like, okay, so I sat down at the piano and I wrote like this 60s ditty, this McCartney-esque ditty, to bring him up again. And instead of playing it on the piano, I'm going to do it on like a modular synthesizer that I'm like turning the LFO way too high so that it sounds like the thing is like disintegrating and like buzzing and glitching, and just gonna have like some drums like just smashing like all over the place, like jazz being played way too loud or something. You never feel like it's kind of working against each other?
And on this album, I really don't. I think that there's more of that on their initial record, their first record, and then their third record. I think there's some of that, but here I feel like it kind of harmonizes, or it comes together really well, to where I don't think that it's overwhelming, and mostly because I think that Trish's like vocal melodies are so catchy that like they sort of like rise above all the noise and stick out, whereas on the other two records I feel like you lose her a bit more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, what did you think about that, Dan?
I sort of agree with Darren. Like I get what you're saying, and I sort of like that about the record, that it is like you like the second song, Pendulum, like had that overdriven synth and those like weird, I don't know if it's a modular synth or like a guitar with effects or whatever, like sounds are happening. Like that, like sort of made it interesting to me. But it also kind of turned into like a one-trick pony sort of thing, and I got like sick of it. You know, it like couldn't sustain a whole record. I thought like the first song I kind of liked a lot. It sort of sounded like the Vaseline's over like Black Angel's Death Song or something, you know, like just...
Yeah, it had like a really John Cale kind of vibe to the noise that's going on.
Yeah, and I liked that. And the first time I listened to the record, I was like, oh, you know, this is gonna be great. And then, you know, Pendulum kind of continued that, and I was like, oh man, yeah. I wish I would have listened to it. And then I was like, oh, okay, we're still doing this. And, you know, and I just kind of, as it went along, I felt more and more like, oh, you know, we're doing this again.
Yeah, I struggle with that too, because like weirdly I feel like some of the later songs on the album are my favorites, and yet I'm so like kind of tired by the time I get there, because it's really one note, like you were saying. It's like, you know, you put these like kind of clanging drums, glitchy sort of synth chord accompaniments, this like plucky bass that sounds like kind of the bass on like Beach Boys instrumentals or something, and then like the soft female vocal, and you know, that's like the palette of every single song. And the album feels so long. Like there were so many times where I would throw this on, and just like you were saying, Dan, I'd be like, this is kind of awesome, and then I'd start to, you know, a little bit later I'd be like, yeah, that was really a nice album, and then I'd look and I'm like, on track 6, you know, like
would not
I still have
how many
so
times
far
I did
to
that.
go.
Especially because Man Is Not a Bird is sort of like the last song that like really catches my attention. I like the drums on it a lot. You know, it's like a nice krautrock beat, and just the production on the drums in that track is like really cool. And that one sort of like was the last one to grab my attention. And then like the 6th track, I'm like, okay, you know, okay, closer here. And then you're like, oh wait, I have another side of this record to go. You know, it just like really, it wasn't bad. Like I don't want to act like I'm shitting on it. Like it's not awful. It just like it really overstays its welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with either of you. I mean, in terms of the overall album as a whole, you know, I even 10 years ago when I wrote that review, I don't think I gave it 5 stars. You know what I mean? I gave it 4.5. That half star. You know what I mean? Like, and I point out some songs that I like on it, and there's a reason for that. Like, there are really strong songs here, but you know, as a cohesive album, I mean, I'm lost by the time I get to like Distortion and The Little Bell and Winter Now and Hawk. I don't even, I know the record's over when there's no more music playing. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have, kind of in contrast to like Boards of Canada, like I don't feel like there's a nice arc going on here.
You could shuffle this record, and I don't.
Yes,
I think Color Me In is a good like intro track.
Yeah, it does. It starts really nicely, and then it just kind of like hits this like plateau and just stays there the entire time, and then it just stops. You know, but it's weird because it's like I like all of the little pieces. Any song you could play, I would pretty much be like I like, and yet there are a couple like interlude type tracks that. They're like kind of interesting, but I feel like they're
unnecessary.
It feels like there's a noise guy in this band, you know, like so they're like let him like fuck around for a little while, you know, and then we'll get back to it. Which to me again is like sort of a problem because I don't feel like the noise is it's not always fully gelling. Sometimes it really nicely is. So like Valerie is a great example of like this. It's kind of like an acoustic. Kind of just nice like 60s ballad almost, like but still nursery rhyme kind of, and the ending is really cool because like these ahs get really reverb heavy and like these glitchy noises like start building and filling, but the whole previous part of the song is just like a little acoustic ditty with just like unnecessary noises added to it because it's almost like they're ashamed of like writing such a simple song and they're like, let's make this artier. So But you know, other than like just a few issues like that. I like really, really like every song. And like I said, some of the last ones are like some of my favorites. Like Hawk is like, I think such a great, it's like the most shoegazy song here.
Yeah.
But it's just like, I don't know. But so what I wanted to kind of ask in regard to Warp Records is, does this like make sense on Warp? Because in some ways it's really interesting that even though I was kind of saying a Warp is like sort of, it feels like futurist, it feels forward looking. This is like really, really, looking back. You know what I mean? It's like evoking that tradition I was talking about of that like early, very early electronic mixing with 60s pop tradition. And it's like, so first question, do you feel like this is nostalgic in a different way from Boards of Canada, or are they both kind of on the same page there?
No, I think if you're going to classify this as nostalgic, I think it's a different type of nostalgia than Boards of Canada. Like I said, with Boards of Canada, it was like it's a fake nostalgia like for this world that they've created, whereas like Broadcast is like an actual just regular nostalgia for something that existed. So I think that's very different things,
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, like I mentioned, Boards of Canada, really difficult to kind of pinpoint what it is they're calling back to.
Exactly.
Not at all difficult, really, with Broadcast. I mean, we're looking right at the 60s, and that's where they're intentionally going, I think.
And the other thing is, I could take a guess as to when this record came out. Whereas Boards of Canada, it's a little different. It doesn't sound like anything, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint it. Whereas this is early 2000s, and I could guess that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is also kind of interesting to think that like Boards of Canada, like, do you guys kind of agree with me? They have like a really strong hip hop vibe that I don't think I was like fully tuned into when I was first discovering them, but they really sound like heavily influenced by hip hop music, and then also influencing hip hop music because the kind of beats that like these like chill hip hop type beats that are on Boards of Canada songs, those are not something you would hear in the 70s. That sounds like very modern.
Exactly.
And it also kind of influences hip hop though, because it's like kind of after this, hip hop starts to get that nostalgia vibe going with like the Jay Dilla kind of production of like old soul records and that grain of like vinyl, and Kanye makes that popular as well. But I feel like they're kind of like, in a way, right in the thick of what is like happening in music then. This is like totally looking back. Would you kind of agree with that distinction?
I would.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate statement.
But you wouldn't say that that's like necessarily a bad thing, right?
No. I mean, it's really difficult actually thinking about them being a Warp artist. Like I didn't really... Obviously, I didn't know when I first started listening to them, and in subsequent years, I never really thought of them as, alongside of Autechre and Autechre Twin and whatever. Right. I just don't think of it like that,
Yeah, I agree with you. It is sort of like a weird, a weird band on the lineup. But you mentioned Grizzly Bear, and I kind of feel like they fit that as well. Like I don't think of Grizzly Bear as like a Warp artist. You think Warp, you think electronic, like, dance music, not like a band. But even like, Danny Brown's latest record was on Warp. I don't think, I always forget that that's a Warp album kind of thing,
Yeah, but this seems like almost one of the first stabs at Broadcast in general. Like one of Warp's first stabs at kind of branching out. But do you feel like would you classify this as like a Warp artist? Would you classify it as electronic music, Dan?
I mean... It's hard.
Or does it not matter? Like,
I think
like increasing diversity a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it just doesn't actually really matter. Because I mean, you got to diversify. They obviously it's a business. They wanna continue on, and if they just get stuck in this rut of what are they gonna do when Aphex retires? And I mean, he basically did for a long time. What are they gonna do when? I mean, I'm sure a lot of their money comes from Aphex himself. Autechre's probably not selling tons and tons of records,
Yeah, I mean, I think that Broadcast earns their place, you know what I mean? I wouldn't say that they're, ripping off or, I mean, Gabe, you mentioned that they're similar to Stereolab, but I mean, I think that they stand out to me, you know what I mean? And they always did stand out even when I first discovered them. And listening to a lot of subsequent bands, there really wasn't anything that was like, oh, this is what Broadcast is definitely like ripping on, or vice versa. So I feel like they probably earned their place, at least among the Warp artists, in terms of like bringing something that's interesting sound wise.
I agree. We've talked about how they sort of like nostalgia looking back and stuff, but I don't think it's not completely that. It's you could tell they're taking their influence as like making something new of it. It's not. We've complained about it. It's not like that whatever Greta Van Fleet band that like loves Led Zeppelin, and so now they're playing Led Zeppelin. I don't think Broadcast is playing Velvet Underground or something. Like they've you can see their influences. They wear them on their sleeve, but it's not that they're just aping them.
Yeah, I feel that. Yeah, basically, because at first I thought this was just kind of like a ripoff of Stereolab, but I've decided that there is something new here, and there's even if it is pretty close, there's plenty of room for both. I also think in regards to their place on Warp, there's something about Broadcast aesthetic which is like outsider, by definition, because a lot of the people that they seem to be inspired by are these like weirdo outsiders, these like weird 60s artists who are interested in like the most primitive synthesizers and just putting like squelching crazy noises and bleeps and bloops and stuff on their records. That's kind of like a niche thing, and like it's almost fitting that they're on a label that they don't quite belong on, and yet I would say that is an interesting part of Warp's legacy, which is like you think of electronic music as being like really future and really new, and I think a lot of that is because of the way Warp actually branded electronic music in the 90s and did so much for that like sort of future looking thing. And yet this band is here to kind of remind us that electronic music goes back like a really long way, and it has this huge legacy of those kind of like weirdo outsiders that were toiling away on, I don't even know what synths looked like, in the mid 60s or whatever, but like toiling away on what must have been the most complicated and finicky machines ever. So in a way it's, maybe it's forcing it, but it's kind of like a nice tribute to the history of electronic music, them being on Warp,
Yeah, I can see that.
At the same time, we were kind of alluding to, this does kind of fit in the like indie-tronica sort of twee pop thing that is like really starting to pop off in 2003. It's like, you got people like Stereolab, like I mentioned, but you've got like the Knot Twist. I don't know if you guys remember them, really trendy at this time. Cornelius, even. We reviewed that in our previous podcast. And then like within just a couple of years, you're going to have people like Hot Chip and Phoenix and MGMT even and stuff like that. And so basically, Dan, I want to ask you, do you feel like this is different? This is like artsier and weirder, like weird enough to not be sort of grouped with the indie-tronica thing, or does it fit right in there?
I think it's a little better. Like I kind of hate that stuff, and I've always sort of hated it. And so I honestly, when Darren picked this record, I thought it was just kind of indie-tronica. And I was really not looking forward to it at all. And I ended up enjoying it. I didn't love it. I probably won't continue to listen to it, but like I did enjoy it. Whereas I think if we were reviewing Hot Chip or I would want to gouge my ears out. So I think it's it's a little. I think it's foreshadowing that movement a little bit, and it's got a little something extra special to it, and I think that's maybe why it belongs on Warp. They should have gave their noise guy a bigger spotlight, maybe.
What do you think about that, Darren?
Yeah,
do they fit in, or do they stand out?
I think they stand out. I think Trish Keenan's vocals, I think, is what really stands out the most. I imagine. I've never obviously, you can't see them live. She passed away in 2011, but the way her style of singing just seems so like kind of like just like a gentle sway, very like shoegazy. I even read somewhere that she's had been described early on in her career as being very shoegazy in her singing style, like not a lot of movement, and when you say like the word indie-tronica, I'm imagining things worthy of dancing to, and I just don't think that anything on this album is quite like that. I think the lullaby melodies, and it's almost like a little spooky at times too. It's not just like cutesy at all.
Yeah.
And
I also felt though
important.
I also felt kind of like, it reminded me of like, it filled me with a little bit of joy about early electronic music, like really early electronic music. Because, like in the 60s and stuff, and, it's like, it's such an odd sound it must have been to hear like, like there were no instruments that could make those weird goopy sounds, and it's like any technology, like how when 3D movies come out, they're like, there's sharks like up in your face and stuff, and then it kind of tones down and becomes like more normal. And actually, in a way, like Boards of Canada is like when it sort of tones down, it just becomes like perfectly natural, electronic music. And in a way, like Broadcast kind of revels in that early, fun of like, do you hear this crazy sound that this thing is making? Like whoop 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 whoop. There's something kind of fun about that, I thought.
Yeah, I could see that. I mean, I do have a soft spot. I love picking up like records of those like they're just like Moog like demonstrations.
Right.
Like what's that one band that would play oh man, I can't think of it now. They would play like rock songs and stuff, but on the Moog.
Yeah.
The name of the band says Moog in it. I can't think of it now. But like, it's always like, yeah, they'll be playing the song and then it'll be like, woo, something crazy. And it's fun. I like that. I like those like noises as like a fun novelty thing. So yeah, I mean, I think Broadcast does like take those sort of fun novelty noises and like work them in. Sometimes they do just a little pasted on the end of a song and whatever. But it's fun. It's cool.
Yeah. So so that's what I feel like kind of makes them stand out. And any reflections on? It sounds like you guys were, I was kind of wondering, like you were, Dan, like listening to this all these years later, is this going to sound like the most dated thing ever? I actually think it has held up in an interesting kind of way, and is worth revisiting if it's something you haven't checked out. And it sounds like you guys agree.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Autechre, to move on, and again, we can bounce back and forth, but Autechre is a pretty fascinating case because they've been with Warp basically since the beginning. They actually helped define that IDM golden age, probably more than Boards of Canada, even, since they were like even on those artificial intelligence series and everything. And yet somehow they've remained like as relevant as ever. Even now, it's kind of different from Broadcast in the sense of that's really this kind of era, that like rediscovering the 60s and playing around with electronics and stuff era, Autechre, and even different for Boards of Canada. Somehow Autechre keeps going on. So Dan's pick, the Elevent EP from 2013, he'll tell us about why he picked it, but Darren, what is your previous experience with Autechre? And I don't suppose you've ever listened to Elevent.
I definitely have not, and my previous experience was whatever it was we reviewed on our last podcast, I believe.
I think we did Try Repete.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Wow. Okay, so that's it. I mean, I am like Dan, a massive, obsessive, like crazy fan of Autechre, and yet, weirdly, I had not really ever listened to the Elevent EP. Autechre is one of those bands where it's like they have so much that there's forever going to be stuff that I haven't spent enough time with or whatever, like an EP I haven't checked out or something. And so I was, kind of intrigued to get into this. I had a strong feeling I would love it. But Dan, what is your, I spoiled it a little, but how are you approaching this, and why did you pick the Elevent EP?
Yeah. Like you said, I'm a massive fan. They're, probably one of my top, 5 or 6 favorite bands ever. I picked this EP, but mostly because I wanted to do late period Autechre, when all the humanity is gone. And basically all those records are 2 hours or plus, 8, some of them are 8, yeah. And right. I didn't think we could get Darren or you or me to listen to an 8-hour record. So I picked Elevent because it's sort of a digestible version of those things. And also, I mean, I had listened to this before, a few times and whatnot, but I've never like spent a week and dug into it. And I thought it would be fun to do that with something I've never done that with, instead of something I already knew like the back of my hand, Yeah,
okay. Yeah. Well, so we're a long ways off from Try Repete, Darren. So I wonder, could you describe the sound of the Elevent EP?
bleeps and bloops.
Did you find any logic in it, or did it just sound totally random?
It didn't sound totally random, but I definitely found myself, wondering what the hell is happening, like what kind of noises are happening. Things just seem to be going by so quickly, especially that first track, which, I mean, admittedly, I love that. I love that sound, actually. I love kind of like listening to it over and over again and trying to like, figure out what's happening. So I didn't really feel like it was like random at all, but yeah, I mean, the sound here is like very abrasive, very different than like Boards of Canada. Like it's amazing that, these guys share like the same genre, the same label, but yet can sound almost like worlds apart,
Yeah, it is.
I mean that in a good way,
Right. And like I said earlier, there seems to be basically nothing nostalgic about this. And something I think I mentioned when we talked about Autechre on we talked about the entire NTS sessions. I think we're going to repost that as a bonus episode next week. But so I might have said this already, but there's something crazy about Autechre where like most electronic music, like 99%, it's kind of like imitating normal instruments. So you have like the bass line. I mean, Boards of Canada is just like this. You have like the key, the lead lines, and you have like it basically is a drum set, even though it's like sort of programmed. It's, you could cover the title track on In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country. You could cover it with a band. You know what I mean? Like you get like, maybe instead of the vocoder, you just get like a children's choir or something. You could do that. This is like so completely unattached to any, there's no, you wouldn't be like, oh, I see, that's kind of doing the tambourine part of this song. Like there's just nothing even connected to acoustic instruments. I do think, though, maybe you can help me out here, Dan. It is really fucking hard to describe Autechre songs for that very reason. So I'm like looking at my notes here, and I've written stuff like sounds like soda fizzing or a paper bag exploding. Like how would you describe the sound of this EP?
Yeah, I mean that's why I like Autechre so much. Is they are just completely like detached from humanity. Like if aliens had, we had met aliens 50 years ago, and like when we went to the moon, we land on the moon, there's aliens there, and we say, give us your best record, and they gave you an Autechre record, you'd be like, yeah, that's kind of, that's what I would have expected. It doesn't sound like Earth or any like culture, it's not like, oh, I can hear, they really like African music, like it doesn't sound like sound like music that's in the world, even from other like electronic people and stuff, like something like Aphex. I don't, he's maybe their closer counterpart, but it's still so like far away from this. I mean,
right.
It's just, it sounds like, I think what a lot of people complain about with electronic music and stuff is that like, it just sounds like computers and stuff. And with Autechre, like, you're completely correct. Like this sounds like what computers sound like. But I love that. It sounds, it's like almost hard to believe that there's two people behind making this.
Oh yeah, that's actually It's like I forget that
they feel like computer programmers more than they sound like or feel like musicians, and I mean that in like the best way possible. I know a lot of people would say that as a negative, but like that's why I like this band. It's just nuts. It's so hard to describe.
When they play live, do they like play songs from multiple records, or is it just like
I've actually
new stuff every time, or what?
Yeah,
well, funny you ask that, actually, because they, this year they dropped like 19 new hours of live recordings, and you actually can hear, basically people are like jokingly call Autechre a jam band now, and so we should probably contextualize the Elevent EP, which is like the accompanying EP to their 11th album, XI, named appropriately XI. Get it? But
I never figured that out. Thanks.
Are you kidding?
Yeah, I swear.
Wow. Amazing. And then it seems like Elevent is also kind of a joke on the word 11. But so basically, this is like sort of a period when first off, their albums get very, very long. So XI is like 2 hours. Next we're coming up with like, LSEC, which is whatever, 5.5 hours. Then we get to NTS sessions, 8 hours. They also get quite harsh, I think, in this period, where like the sounds get really abrasive and like almost ravey. We talked about like there's no trace of nostalgia, but at some points I do feel like there's almost like a callback to kind of like the rave era that you can actually hear a lovely taste of on the Warp Tapes thing that they just released of like their earliest compositions, which is kind of cool. You can sort of feel that thread running through. But I also think that XI, it's hard to tell, but marks the beginning of like this jam band period where they actually do like improvisation. I think they get interested before this in like generative sequences where things are like they're like setting rules and the computer is like kind of randomizing and stuff based on the rules they've set. But here they seem to sort of like get interested in taking over. So what I was going to say about those live sets, Darren, is that you can actually listen night to night and the sets are changing and they're improvising and like, you know, actually seem to be like jamming these sets in a way. And so I wonder, when you listen to this, Darren, do you hear any human element at all? Does it strike you as a jam kind of a band?
I mean, it doesn't quite strike me as a jam. Like, I can imagine, you know, kind of it starts as a jam and then they just kind of tinker with it until it's what they want it to be. I just feel like it you know, as opposed to like Boards of Canada, like you mentioned, it sounds like a band could probably cover some of that. Here, I feel like you have just pages and pages of different settings and pieces of equipment and specific like computer settings and all this stuff that like it would be impossible to try to like put all that together and like recreate it again alongside other bits of their albums. You know what I mean? You get what I'm saying? Like you couldn't just show, like when you're a band with a discography, even if you're the Beatles and you had different you know, eras, like you still show up with the same instruments and you just kind of play things. Yeah. But here I just feel like it just sounds like there's so many intricate like settings and samples and things happening that like it would be ridiculous to say, okay, you know, let's have Autechre come out and play all of Elevent plus some of NTS or whatever. You know what I mean? It seems hard to imagine, I guess.
Like I saw them live in Orlando. You can listen to that. It's one of those ones they put up, but like they just have two computers, you know, each one sitting on a laptop. They play completely in the dark, and yeah, you know, I think when you say like there's not actually like a lot of equipment. I think it is just sort of all computer, you know, like VSTs and stuff. And they use this program. It's called Max SP or something like that. And it's like I've tried to mess around with it, but you gotta be like smarter than me. And like essentially they like sort of are like programming this program to play the songs. So like on these live records that they've released, you know, like Night to Night, it's the same, like you could say like that's the same song. You know, it's not like, you know, these exact notes happen every time, but you know, it's the same skeleton that they sort of, like Gabe said, jammed around. And at least that period and the little bit before, you know, that I've heard live things from, they don't play like, you know, oh fuck, here's a hit from Tri Repete. You know, it's sort of they only play stuff that will, like, in 2 years you look back and like, hey, they played that, you know, when I saw them or something. You know, I don't think they really ever play like if you saw them on tour when this record came out, like I don't think you would have heard this record, you know?
Right. Well, okay. That's an interesting thing about them is that they like, you know, unlike something like Boards of Canada, because like you, Darren, I was kind of like contrasting them in my mind, and also with Broadcast a little bit, they don't seem to have like a sound. Boards of Canada amazingly seems to like emerge kind of fully formed. Maybe there are some hardcore fans who know like their earliest shit that I don't, but they kind of come out sounding like Boards of Canada. It's a revelatory sound, and then they've always sounded that way. Sometimes they like turn up the darker shades or whatever, or get a little more spacious like they do on this EP we talked about. But you know, that's the Boards of Canada sound. Autechre like just has no sound because they're this act that is just constantly changing, like they're chasing something. And it's interesting because it seems like part of their process is to like release just buckets of music, you know, just constantly be releasing. They release, you know, like an EP that's like a remix of one of their albums, and it's actually like twice as long as the album itself, and a 2-hour EP. It's like they just keep doing it, and it's kind of interesting because if you think about, I thought about a band like Radiohead, just because I think we're thinking about talking about them next week, but Radiohead is one of those kind of searcher bands. They're kind of different from Boards of Canada in that way. They're always searching, and yet what they do is they wait till they've like hit a plateau or something to reveal where they've been going. So like Autechre is like, imagine if between OK Computer and Kid A, Radiohead released like 2 albums and 6 EPs, and you got to hear every step along that transformation, like, and it feels like when you listen to these live sets, they're like, there's an active sound of them trying to get somewhere. I think that's one of the coolest parts about them. You agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, listening to like Incunabula or whatever that first record's called, and then listening to this, you wouldn't guess that's the same band unless you were in the know, and I mean, it's great. I mean, I love that, like, no two things like that they've ever released like really sound alike. They're always like moving forward. They're always, when you think it can't get any crazier, you get 8 hours of something that's crazier.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, 8 hours. Like, what is happening for 8 hours that warrants 8 hours? You know what I mean? Like, I would not want to listen to an 8-hour Radiohead record, and I also don't think I would be all that interested in listening to like 2 albums and 6, EPs between OK Computer and Kid A. So what is?
Well,
what is
you
so
see,
Darren,
Darren, it's a pleb filter. It gets rid of. No, I see what you mean, and I mean, I don't think they expect anyone to sit and listen to it all in one go. Because even LSEC, which is like 5 hours, it's called LSEC 1 to 5, which I think implies that like you can listen, like maybe put LSEC 1 on and then 2. It doesn't mean like sit and listen to 1 through 5 in one.
It's like a collection.
And NTS, the 8-hour thing is sort of the same way. And like Gabe alluded to, we're going to put up. Gabe and I did an episode of our old podcast together where we went through all 8 hours.
I'm trying to keep my like fanboying in check, but if you want to hear me and Dan just free to fanboy out with no Darren there, to keep us in check, that's what it is.
No, exactly, and we'll post that next week. So if people didn't hear it, they can listen to it. Yeah.
So I think there's something about that where it is sort of kept in like digestible chunks in a way, and they also kind of are interestingly divided into eras in a way, which like makes it, possible to kind of like dive in different spots. But there's also something about like, at this point, like being an Autechre fan is like being a Grateful Dead fan or something, or like a Fish fan even, because you just get obsessed and you have to hear more. Like, I get what you mean, Darren. Like with Radiohead, I guess I wouldn't want that much material. Like I like that they wait till the new sound is fully formed and then reveal it to us. But with Autechre, I want to listen to literally all 19 hours of this new live set, and I want to hear the music like change in just small ways like every night, and I want to listen to like every EP and like every album, and it's just. What do you think, Dan? Why do they inspire that kind of like obsession?
I think, like with me, I mean, I just love like cool sounds being created. Like I talked about, I like those like weird Moog records. Like I just like sounds.
And think about like I always appreciate when you listen to Autechre, you're hearing sounds that like basically the human ear has never heard before.
That's what I was getting to. Like it is just like you're hearing these sounds that like nobody's probably even thought of that sound before. Like what is that? Like it's
this
like
is the fanboying I was talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Earlier.
Yeah, if you want to hear a whole hour of that. But no, it's like it's like this most like futuristic thing. I think it. Like was the guy Luigi something? He was one of the futurists, and he wrote like this whole big thing about like noise music. But he wrote it in 1900s, so he means a little different. But like just the like how like we would get accustomed to the sounds of industry and steam and everything, and like this I think is like the perfect realization of what he's talking about. These are sounds that like didn't exist. Like imagine someone pre-industrial revolution, just hearing one of these sounds, like just take a 2-second clip of this, it would blow their goddamn mind. They've never heard anything like this, and I just think it like really is like the perfect example of like that futurist idea, and I just love that.
So is there a challenge to like constantly innovate? Like every time you guys hear about a new Autechre record, are you going in being like, man, I can't wait to hear what kind of new stuff, new sound my ears are going to hear? And like if that is what you're going for, have you ever been like disappointed and then felt like they didn't push the envelope?
I firmly believe that they are. So again, fanboy warning, but like in my mind, I put Autechre like right next to John Cage or like Stockhausen or like Ornette Coleman or something, where it's like, or like Shakespeare, for fuck's sake, where it doesn't matter.
Here we go.
I'm telling you, like it doesn't even matter what's good or bad. Because you don't go to a museum and be like, oh, this is like a bad Picasso painting. It's just like, oh, this is a Picasso, so it's important. We should look at it and know it.
Yeah.
I feel that way about Autechre, where it's like Elevent is a pretty minor work. It's not like really highly acclaimed at all. I loved listening to it this week, and I just, was struck with the like, well, it doesn't matter if it's like not one of their major steps forward, because that's kind of what you're asking, Darren, is like, it feels like with each like big project, they do a big step forward, but they're really fun about releasing these little like, these little branches. So they'll like usually do an album and then a couple EPs and stuff. And I guess lately they've just kind of been putting the EP material in the album itself, but it's like, they're like, here's like the thing, and you can explore all different ways, but like good or bad, I just don't even really consider. Am I crazy, Dan?
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's I mean, is there ever been a more fanboy thing to say than comparing them to Shakespeare, though? But
and saying like what is good and bad when it comes to music.
I'm telling you, like, because historically, like, if John Cage's whatever work is good or bad, just doesn't matter. It's just like you should know it if you want to be
exactly.
No, I think I agree with you. The same
or
can
Beethoven.
Be said about like Beethoven. Exactly. Yeah, like some undiscovered piece of Beethoven's music or whatever, like, oh, it's Beethoven, it's immediately going to be important.
Exactly. So, like immediately commands your attention. And I think that's the same here. I mean, they're just like,
it sounds crazy, but I promise you in 50 years people talk about fucking Autechre the way they talk about like Stockhausen or whatever.
I
would bet anything.
I completely agree with you. I get the same sort of like feelings listening to Autechre that I do with those sort of things, Stockhausen, Cage, Reich, I get the same like sort of like inspiration to create music and everything, that I feel exactly the same about that when I listen to Autechre. So I think you're definitely right.
Yeah. And okay, so we veered like far into gushing territory and like forgot to talk about the EP itself, but I do think it's a wonderful EP because it does start off like quite noisy and like wild and chaotic. And another fun thing about Autechre is you always feel like there's a logic to it, but you like can't quite get it. You're like, I think there's a time signature here and I almost understand it, but like it's always like a one step away or something. But I think that this EP, just like the In a Beautiful Place Out in the Country EP, it has a really cool arc because it starts off very clattering and aggressive. And then it's almost like you kind of like look deeper into that sound, and then you get into like these like wide open like just digital spaces or something where there's like, on the middle two tracks, M39 Defane and Osla 4N, they have great track names. It's like there's a lot of wide open space. I love how they'll just kind of like add like reverb or like crush digital distortion to things. To kind of like give you this huge sense of depth where you were like least expecting it. It'll be like a really dry series of sounds, and then all of a sudden it's like this wide open, like it just sounds huge and cavernous, and you really feel like you're inside. I again, fanboying, but it's like I feel like you start with this Tacklacora thing, it's just clattering craziness, and then you like kind of look beneath the clattering, and it's just like the abyss beneath it or something. And then I like how Newbound, the last track here, actually gets quite melodic. It's amazing because Osla for N, it gets so non-musical in a way that I was like writing notes down like, it doesn't even feel right to call this discordant because it's not even music anymore. And then Newbound brings like some kind of melody there, and it works kind of like a coda, just like Zoetrope did on the Boards of Canada EP. Do you kind of agree with this, like this flow, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I read like the Pitchfork review for this, and they said like the Oslo for in, like, you know, that like percussion sound, it sounds like a cough. And like they said it sounded like something like a sick computer or something. And it does, and it sort of feels like, you know, you're going through almost like the computer's life. And the Newbound, I felt like Newbound is sort of like the funeral, like, you know, I couldn't get over that cough. And
this is another thing I love about like Autechre is like, if you go on the Autechre subreddit, you know, there's like, it's so hard to talk about them that people come up with these crazy like,
yeah, because
I feel like you're in the wheel of a car and it's like when the spokes are like hitting you in the head over and over, you know, like just the metaphors they come up with are incredible.
I know, but I mean, that, like I said at the start of this, like, it's because this feels like it's not from Earth, you know, like, how do you explain something that like you have no cultural reference point for, you know, because like, I mean, when we talked about broadcast, we said, oh, it reminds me of you know, Vaseline's or Velvet Underground or, you know, whatever,
right,
like
right.
We're anytime we review music, talk about music, we do that so much. And Autechre, you know, we said it gives us the same sort of feelings as Cage and Stockhausen and stuff, but it doesn't really sound like those things,
right.
You know, it's just so completely like of its own world. It's almost impossible to like describe it without making up these like sort of stories or anything. But that's another thing I love about it. You know, it's like great music to just put on, like, you know, get your nicest headphones, like, you know, lay back and and get immersed in this world that they've created for you. Decide what it means to you and have a good time.
Yeah. What did you think, Darren? Did you come to like this whole EP? Did you feel like it had an interesting flow and arc?
I mean, I think it did, and I did like it a lot, you know.
Wow, I'm amazed.
I mean, I'll take 20 whatever minutes of Autechre versus 8 hours, you know. I think I got my fill. Like I mentioned, I really love the opening track. I thought that was like, I just love how abrasive it is, you know. I love that sound that I just can't describe because it's just not really easy, you know, to describe it. And then the last track, like you mentioned, just like with Boards of Canada, I feel like it's like fully earned. Like it's a really good conclusion track. Like I look forward to it, and then the two tracks before sort of kind of continued the journey. Like I don't know why it's actually, you know, I said that like they seem worlds away from Boards of Canada, but these two EPs really are very similar in how they start and finish. And it you know, it would be hard to tell somebody like, hey, listen to this EP and now check out an 8-hour, you know, record or whatever. Like it's pretty amazing that somebody who's so good at making, you know, 2+ hours of music for one album can also do just a quick 25-30 minute record, you know what I mean? I think that's impressive, right?
Yeah, that actually I hadn't thought of it that way, but that is because sometimes, you know, a lot of minimalist work, it like a big part of it, and I love it, I'm not trying to knock this, but it's like kind of like bowling you over with the sheer size and like challenge of it. And
Lamont Young and stuff.
Yeah, Autechre does that, but they actually don't have to. Like the well-tuned piano would not, if it was 20 minutes, it would not be like very interesting, I don't think. You know, it's like it requires the size, but Autechre doesn't necessarily need the size to like do a lot. You know, I wanted to ask about Autechre's legacy. I think it's kind of fascinating because when you think of Warp, you know, I want to talk about this a little bit, but they're trying to grow, they're trying to change, like diversify the roster a little bit and stuff, but maybe it'll just always be the case that Warp will be associated with the IDM of the 90s, you know, in the early 2000s, where it's like the Autechre Twin and the Boards of Canada's and all that stuff. And those artists, you know, like Autechre Twin released like Cyro a couple years ago, and it was great, but it was like Autechre Twin, you know, it's not like the music of the future again, you know, it's the music of the future from the 90s sort of. And how has Autechre, they seem to be the only ones of all these IDM, you know, juggernauts that have remained relevant. Like, how have they done that?
I mean, I just think it's those two guys, you know, Sean and Rob. I think they are just like obsessed with sounds, and you know, like I just feel like there's some sort of like geniuses that you know, it's beyond our comprehension. I think it's just like being like, they just feel like people that, like, if they didn't constantly search for those new noises, that they'd stop living, you know? Like, does that make any sense?
Yeah, okay. Maybe a little strong, but you know,
I didn't compare them to Shakespeare, at least.
I guess that's true. Yeah. I mean, I do kind of feel like, yeah, they're tireless, which helps a lot. They do also happen to be brilliant, I think, and it is kind of interesting because if you listen to like these sounds, you know, like the cutting edge of electronic music right now is, you know, like these labels like Object or like Pan or Hyperdub or whatever. You think of like an artist like Arca or like that Mono Noa Ware compilation we talked about 2 years ago or whatever. Like, these are the artists that are like kind of on the cutting edge, and those sounds actually, like, Autechre like basically fits right in there. They, in fact, like Elevent in the XI period is really like, and actually even before that, is really feels several years ahead of where electronic music was going. And so they don't at all work like Boards of Canada, which is like the Boards of Canada sound. They seem to be like one of those artists like Bob Dylan or something we talked about like a couple episodes ago, who is just, they're just kind of like incredible at being ahead of the curve and like pushing electronic music as far as it can go. I think about like, you know, Confield or like some of their like even late 90s albums, you know, where they seem to be getting interested in like algorithmic generative composition, you know? And it's amazing because now like algorithms rule our life. Mm-hmm. And they were like doing it before any of that was happening. And then, instead of like continuing, now that algorithms do rule everything, they, you know, got their hands dirty and went into jam band mode, like the least expected twist I could imagine. But I think I do think they just have one of those like special abilities to kind of be a few steps ahead. Does Elevent, Darren, give you any like indication of that kind of forward thinking? I mean, does it feel fresh? Does it feel innovative and modern to you?
It does. You know, it did kind of, it remind me a bit of that Aphex Twin record. Well, I think he released it under like the Tuss, right? Okay. And if I remember that record, it's pretty abrasive as well. But I don't know if I could say for sure that that this is like unlike anything I've ever heard before. You know, just these 4 tracks here. But I can certainly see what you're saying in terms of like always sort of forward looking, you know, that they're not necessarily pandering to what is trending or what's going on, you know what I mean? Like, right. they may not even be listening at all to what's happening now. Kind of similar to like how I feel about, you know, Tom York and Radiohead. Like, I don't feel like they don't even care what's really popular or what's trending right now. They've kind of formulated their own sound and they're just pushing the boundaries of that sound, you know. Fortunately for you guys, that sound is like a huge universe for them to explore. So it seems like they've got plenty of room to kind of grow in just in that area, but they don't, you know what I mean? Like, they don't have to answer to any of these other trends that are happening. And that's, you know, only a few artists I feel like have really earned that.
Yeah. I think like at this point somehow, and for me, actually, it's weird because XI was like the moment this happened for me, where I was like always an Autechre fan, and then I do kind of find some of their middle period albums like very challenging, to where like I still feel like they haven't really clicked for me, some of them. But XI, I was suddenly like, you know, it was like the beginning of this kind of jamming phase and like this onslaught of material, and I was like, I think this is like my favorite band ever. Like, I'm just gonna listen to everything forever because I just can't believe what I'm hearing. You know, I think we could start turning toward wrapping up here. If we think about these 3 acts and all the other acts we sort of touched on, you know, how would you describe Warp's legacy? Like, how did they affect music in that sort of golden age?
I mean, I think it's thanks to Warp that like we have electronic music. I mean, electronic music is basically the like dominant force nowadays. You know, I mean, it's tied like pop music has electronics in it. Hip hop has electronics. Everything has it. And I think I think Warp is a huge reason behind that. I mean, it's like nuts that like Aphex Twin was like an actual like kind of star for a time in the 90s. Like it was played on MTV and stuff, which is like insane. And I think that we owe that completely to Warp.
Yeah, what do you think, Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think of electronic music, especially early on before I really knew Aphex Twin and stuff, I think of a lot of like sort of anonymous people, just nameless DJs that are, just putting music out and stuff like that. But pretty much, these Warp artists, I feel like had a lot more personality behind them. Aphex Twin, of course. Even Autechre, I'm kind of new to Autechre, but, I think Boards of Canada, for instance, like they're such like recognizable names, you know what I mean? In this like vast sea, especially nowadays of, just electronic artists. I mean, like you mentioned, the YouTube channel of just people making electronic music. Like you have no idea who they are. It's definitely worth mentioning that, like, hey, this record label has like the juggernauts of like electronic music, and if anybody's ever interested in checking out electronic music, what better place to start than somewhere on the Warp label? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that I really think that they're like hugely responsible, like you said, Dan, for like the sound of music today. And I think like legitimizing electronic music. If you think about like the 90s, like electronic music seemed kind of like geeky to me. Like when I was young, there was like almost a stereotype of like a geeky kid who walks around like with headphones on and he just listens to like techno. And when I thought of techno, I just thought of like boom, 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 and it was like it was geeks. It was like computer nerds and stuff. And then like all of a sudden Warp is giving us like rock stars like Richard D. James and giving us like sort of compositional geniuses like Boards of Canada or, Autechre, or like, weird oddball, like inventive 60s pop throwback stuff with like people like Broadcast. And like, it just like seems to blow the whole thing open to me, where it's like not niche at all. It's like a whole world, and it really does take over. I think Warp is really hugely responsible for that, that legitimacy. But what is Warp today? Because it was interesting. I didn't even know some of these people were on their roster when I was like looking at who was performing at this NTS takeover that they did. People like Danny Brown and Death Grips and stuff, and it's like, are they just kind of going to be an iconic label from the 90s and early 2000s, or do you feel like they're kind of reinventing themselves and growing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with all the people, that are currently on the label. I think the latest like Flying Lotus album is on there and stuff.
Right. Well, I think all of his records
are
been on there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a newer kind of not a 90s electronic thing. That's that's the word I was looking for. But I think like a little bit, they are sort of a legacy label. But that, I mean, they've been going for 30 years. What label isn't just kind of a legacy label at that, after that amount of time?
Yeah, what do you think, Darren? What does Warp mean today?
I mean, I think it's still an iconic label. Like I was kind of mentioning, I think they carry with them some of the juggernauts of electronic music. And even when, like Dan, when you mentioned, like when Aphex Twin retires and some of these names are no longer creating brand new music, I still think, Warp, I can't imagine Warp finding another Aphex Twin level or, Rising Star or whatever. I just think that they've pretty much solidified that legacy with an artist like Aphex Twin, and any newcomer coming along is probably going to be living in that shadow for a long time. Yeah. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that sort of thing. I mean, it's important to continue to diversify and bring in, Flying Lotus and other people for sure, but the legacy is going to kind of always be there, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that they've been like sort of passed up by some of those labels I was talking about earlier, like these more cutting edge electronic music labels, but like they'll always have this legacy. And I think honestly, like this idea of let's throw a festival and look back at 30 years of Warp is kind of going to be like the space that they're in. And I honestly think it's kind of great because they've got like enough kind of cool new artists that are like interesting, but they've also got like this huge legacy that really every like 5-10 years is actually, did you know that the side note, Autechre Krakow set, the first set on AE Live, was performance at the Warp 25th anniversary party.
I didn't know that. No.
So every 5 years, let's do it. Let's celebrate the legacy of Warp. And I think that some are gonna, they're gonna have artists like Autechres who like kind of keep pushing the boundaries and Flying Lotus and stuff. But we'll always have like these kind of memories of Boards of Canada broadcasts and artists like that. And I think that's great. Any last minute thoughts? Any big takeaways? What did we learn today? I always ask this and we never really
I think we never learn anything. Well, how about this? What did you learn? Email us and let us know. Yeah.
Nice.
You can email us. That's popshieldpod@gmail.com. We'll have our next episode in 2 weeks. Like Gabe said, we're going to talk about Radiohead most likely. And in a week, we'll release our NTS session rerun from Autechre. So if you like Autechre, check that out. It's just Gabe and I fanboying for, I think it's like 2 hours long.
We go deep, though.
Yeah, we go deep. No, we really do. So if you like the show, help us out, subscribe, leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that stuff is at PopShieldPod, and we'll see ya in 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.